I was a sophomore at a suburban high school, one of those places where the hallways seemed to groan under the weight of strict rules and decades of routine. The school had just gone through renovations, new paint, fresh lockers, upgraded classrooms. But some parts of the building had been left untouched, almost as if the administration wanted to preserve a certain atmosphere. The locker area, in particular, had an old, creaky feel to it, with flickering fluorescent lights and pipes rattling overhead. It wasn't a place where you'd want to linger after hours, but it was where I was assigned my locker, right near the end of a dim corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. From the moment I first stood in front of that locker, I felt something was off. The metal door was scratched up, with deep gouges inside the paint, almost like someone had tried to claw their way out, or in. I remember running my fingers over those scratches, the rough edges digging into my skin, and feeling a chill crawl up my spine despite the warm fall air outside. Whenever I opened it, there was a faint, musty smell, like stale dust mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. I tried telling my friends about it, but they just laughed, saying I was imagining things or maybe just nervous about starting the new school year. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me whenever I approached that locker. Sometimes, when I was alone in the hallway between classes, I'd hear whispers, barely audible, like a breath or a murmur, coming from inside the locker. I'd freeze, heart pounding, and swing the door open, but there was never anyone there. Just the empty metal compartment and the faint scent of that mustiness. My friends insisted it was just the wind or my imagination, but I wasn't so sure. There was an uneasy presence I couldn't explain, a weight that pressed down on me every time I touched the locker door. The first real moment that scared me happened one evening after basketball practice. I was exhausted and ready to go home, but when I got to my locker to grab my jacket, I found the door wide open. I was positive I'd locked it before leaving. I always did. My heart jumped as I stepped closer, half expecting someone to be hiding inside, but it was empty. Then, folded neatly on the bottom of the locker was a small note. I unfolded it carefully, the paper crinkling in my hands, and read the words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Don't trust the walls. The message made no sense, but the feeling of dread that washed over me was very real. What was even stranger was the air inside the locker. It was a warm day, and the hallway was stuffy, but when I peered inside, I saw what looked like breath fogging up the metal interior. My breath, visible in the air from cold, was impossible. I stepped back quickly, my skin prickling with goosebumps, and slammed the door shut. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself it was a prank, but the sinking feeling in my chest told me otherwise. After that night, the incidents only got worse. The locker would sometimes slam shut on its own when I was nowhere near it, the echoes bouncing off the empty hallway walls. I started noticing cold spots right around that area, like walking through a patch of icy air that wasn't explained by drafts or open windows. It was as if something was lurking within the metal confines, watching, waiting. I told a few teachers, but they brushed it off, saying lockers sometimes stick or lock mechanisms fail. My friends tried to convince me to just switch lockers, but there was something about that locker that felt like it was tied to me, like it held some secret I needed to uncover. One afternoon, I stayed late after school to finish a project. The halls were silent except for the distant hum of the janitor's cart. I went to my locker to grab some papers and noticed the scratches inside the door had deepened, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at the metal overnight. My fingers trembled as I traced the new marks. They almost looked like letters, but I couldn't make out what they spelled. My skin crawled, and I slammed the door shut, hurrying back to the classroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. The note's words kept echoing in my mind. Don't trust the walls. What did it mean? Was it a warning? I started paying attention to the walls around the locker area the next day. I noticed faint, almost imperceptible cracks in the paint, small holes that looked like they'd been patched poorly over time. I pressed my ear against the wall, half expecting to hear something, and caught a faint scratching sound. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but the sound was definitely there. I remember one particularly unsettling moment when, after school, I lingered near the locker, waiting for my mom to pick me up. The hallway was empty except for me, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Suddenly, the locker door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at the empty compartment. Then I heard it, a whisper, clearer than before. right inside the locker. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded urgent, desperate. I stepped back quickly, and the door slammed shut with a finality that echoed down the corridor. I was terrified, but also strangely compelled to keep going back. It was like the locker had a hold on me, drawing me in with its secrets. I started to avoid it as much as possible, but every time I had to open it, I felt that cold breath on my neck, heard the faint whispers, and saw the scratches deepen as if by some unseen force. One day, I found a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the corner inside the locker. This time, the note was different. It read, "They watch through the cracks." I looked around the hallway, the walls suddenly seeming to close in, shadows stretching longer than they should. I wanted to tear the note up and throw it away, but a part of me was afraid to destroy it. What if it was a clue? Or a warning? I talked to a janitor once, hoping to find out more about the locker or the hallway. He told me the school was built decades ago, and that part of the building had been sealed off for years due to structural damage. He mentioned rumors about a student who had disappeared during the 70s, last seen near that corridor. The story wasn't official, just whispers among the staff, but it added another layer of unease to my experience. By this point, I was exhausted from the late nights and creeping fear every time I walked past that locker. I started carrying pepper spray in my backpack and tried to stay with friends as much as possible. Still, the locker called to me, the scratches and notes pulling me back into that same cold, silent hallway. One afternoon, I found the locker door wide open yet again, but this time, instead of a note, there was a small, broken mirror lying inside. I stared at it, the shards reflecting my anxious face back at me in fractured pieces. As I reached in to pick it up, a sharp chill swept over me, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow move just behind me in the reflection. I spun around quickly, but the hallway was empty. I left the mirror in the locker and hurried away, my heart pounding. I knew I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? I was too scared to switch lockers, too curious to leave it alone, and too exhausted to keep pretending it was all in my head. Every day, I walked past those scratched walls and that haunted locker, wondering what secrets it kept, and whether I would be the next to disappear into the shadows that watched through the cracks. After the unsettling experiences with my locker, I found myself seeking refuge in the school library more often. It was a large, city high school library, with towering shelves packed tightly with books, and rows of tables where students could spread out their work. I wasn't the type to hang out much during lunch or after school, but the library felt like a safe haven, quiet, predictable, and surrounded by knowledge. I often stayed late to finish homework or projects, especially because my home was noisy and distracting. One rainy evening, I arrived just as the last bell rang. Most students had already left, and the library was nearly empty. The only sounds were the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the steady patter of rain against the tall windows. I settled into a corner table in the back, tucked away behind a row of tall bookshelves that gave me some privacy. The dim lighting made the space feel cozy, but also a bit eerie, like I was somewhere between the present and the past. As I pulled out my notebooks and laptop, I felt a strange stillness in the air. The usual hum of whispered conversations and chair legs scraping against the floor was gone. It was just me and the storm outside. I tried to focus on my work, but every few minutes, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flickering shadow between the shelves. It never stayed long or came fully into view, but it was enough to make me glance up and around nervously. The rain intensified, and the lights overhead began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but then a cold draft swept through the aisles, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, glancing toward the entrance. The heavy wooden doors were closed, and I was sure no one else had come in since I arrived. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps echoing softly on the linoleum floor. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned around quickly, expecting to see a librarian or maybe another late student. But there was no one there, just the empty aisle and the silence. I sat frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself it was my imagination playing tricks. But then, out of the corner of my vision, I saw it again, a shadowy figure, blurred and indistinct, standing at the edge of the bookshelf. When I turned to look directly, it vanished, as if it had melted into the darkness between the books. Panic began to rise in my throat. I packed up my things hurriedly, my hands shaking. As I stood, the lights flickered again, plunging the library into near darkness for a moment before flickering back on. The cold draft returned, stronger this time, swirling around me like an invisible breath. I rushed toward the exit, but just as I reached the door, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft I almost didn't catch it, but it was there, a voice, barely audible, calling my name. I stopped, heart hammering, and scanned the room. The shadow figure appeared again, this time closer, at the far end of the aisle. Its form was hazy, like smoke or mist, but there was something unmistakably human about it. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and bolted out of the library, the heavy doors slamming shut behind me. Outside, the rain was still falling, cold and steady. I leaned against the brick wall, trying to catch my breath and steady my nerves. I told myself it was just stress, that I'd been working too hard and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I hesitated before entering the library again. The memory of that shadowy figure and the whisper haunted me, but I needed a quiet place to study. I took a seat near the front this time, under bright fluorescent lights and close to the librarian's desk, hoping to feel safer. The day passed uneventfully, and I began to breathe easier. But as the week went on, strange things kept happening. The lights flickered unpredictably, sometimes plunging the room into darkness for a second or two. Books would fall off the shelves on their own, startling the few students who stayed late. In the shadows, I kept catching glimpses of them darting just out of sight, always near the tall shelves where the library was darkest. One evening, I stayed very late, the rain hammering against the windows and the library nearly empty again. I was absorbed in a history paper when the lights flickered once more. A cold draft swept through the aisles, and I heard that same slow, deliberate footsteps sound behind me. This time I didn't turn immediately. I wanted to see if it was real or just my imagination. The footsteps stopped just behind my chair. I felt a presence close by, but when I looked over my shoulder, nothing was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly gathered my things. As I stood, a dark shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I tried to focus on it. I hurried out of the library, the doors slamming shut behind me again. Outside, I saw the janitor locking up nearby, but he seemed oblivious to what I'd just experienced. I started asking around about the library's history and discovered an old rumor that the school's first librarian had died in that very building decades ago. Some said her spirit still lingered, watching over the books and the students who stayed too late. The thought made the shadowy figure seem more real, more like a guardian or a warning. Despite my fear, the library remained my refuge, the only place I could focus amidst the chaos of school and the unsettling feeling that had settled over me since the locker incidents. I kept an eye on the shadows, always aware that I might not be alone, and I never stayed after dark anymore. Yet, every so often, when the rain pattered against the windows and the lights flickered, I thought I heard a whisper, soft and urgent, calling me back into the dim aisles where the night library shadow waited. During my senior year, a substitute teacher arrived to cover for one of my regular teachers who'd taken a week off. At first, he seemed perfectly normal, friendly enough, with a calm voice and a willingness to help students who had questions. But there was something about him that felt off, like he was watching us more closely than a substitute usually would. I noticed he seemed particularly fixated on certain students, including me. He asked questions that felt invasive, probing about where we went after school, who we hung out with, and even what time we usually left the building. At first, I thought maybe he was just trying to be friendly or make conversation, but as the days passed, his interest felt less innocent. He would linger in the classroom long after other teachers had left, sometimes pacing the empty hallways alone. Rumors began swirling among students and staff about his past. Some said he'd been fired from previous schools under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered about students who had disappeared or transferred suddenly while he was around. The stories were vague, but enough to make me uneasy. One afternoon, after our last class, I noticed him following me down the hallway. I was walking to meet friends, keeping my head down and trying to act casual, but I could feel his eyes on me. He called out, asking if I wanted extra help with homework, insisting I stay late after school. I politely declined, but he didn't seem to take no for an answer. His tone grew insistent, and I realized I was alone in that part of the building. My heart pounded. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I was afraid of what might happen if I did. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, hoping to reach the crowded main hallway. I spotted a teacher nearby and hurried toward her, explaining the situation breathlessly. She immediately called school security while I stayed close, trying not to panic. Security arrived quickly and approached the substitute, who was now pacing nervously. When questioned, he gave vague answers about just wanting to help students. But something didn't sit right. An investigation was launched, and it turned out he wasn't who he claimed to be. He was an imposter, with a history of stalking students and using false identities to get close to them. The school removed him immediately, and the police were involved. Looking back, I realize how close I came to being in serious danger. The experience left me shaken and hyper-aware of the importance of trusting my instincts. I often think about the weeks before he was caught, the way he watched and waited, the way he tried to isolate me after class. It's a relief to know he's gone, but the memory of those days still lingers. This year, more than ever, I've learned to listen to that uneasy feeling in my gut, to speak up even when it's hard, and to be cautious about who I trust. High school was supposed to be a safe place, but sometimes the real threats aren't just the shadows or strange whispers. They're the people who hide behind a friendly face.